Let's take you to Sydney, where Opposition Leader Peter Dutton is making a speech about his nuclear policy.
Chris, nobody could have imagined that AUKUS was possible because the Labor Party had always been against a nuclear submarine. It was possible because we had the ability to negotiate the deal with the United States and the United Kingdom. We did the deal supported on a bipartisan basis in the United States and in the United Kingdom. And Labor, to its credit in opposition, under Anthony Albanese's leadership, signed up to the AUKUS deal. Now, that's why now we've moved on from the debate about safety and disposal. The government has accepted that it is a safe technology and that disposal is possible in our country. So I think on the basis of, as Sam pointed out before, if you're talking about a scientific-based approach, if you're looking at the facts as opposed to the emotion, if you're looking at the international experience and what is in our country's best interests, I don't believe that you can arrive at a different conclusion. It's why Peter Malinauskas is fully signed up to nuclear in South Australia with the Osborne docking of the nuclear submarines, the work that will take place on the reactors. A similar story for the Labor government in Western Australia, where at the port in Henderson, they're going to be into an indefinite period, for decades to come, tying up nuclear submarines there, working on those nuclear submarines. Again, that puts the question of safety beyond doubt. And I think with South Australia, we could strike a deal very quickly. The only reservation Peter Malinauskas has expressed about nuclear is in relation to cost, and I believe that we can deal with those concerns in due course.
Since you raised it, I've been to Plant Vogel in the United States. It started in the year 2009 to build 2 plants. I'm very supportive of nuclear energy, but it is undoubtedly expensive. It cost $30 billion US. The last plant was only commissioned this year. So how do you deal with the cost issue, which is a central issue to this debate?
Well, Chris, we're not talking about being a first type, not being first in class. We can look at the international experience, look at what the Koreans are doing, look at what has happened in the UAE, look at Westinghouse and the AP1000s and what's happened in the United States as recently as May, the 4th unit there commissioned, and look at what's happening in France and elsewhere. We don't need to build a bespoke reactor. We can rely on the proven technologies. And if we do that, we can avoid some of the initial cost and time blowouts that are a feature of a newest technology. That's not what we're proposing. We're not proposing to reinvent the wheel here. We want to learn from and benefit from the international experience. And if you contrast either the capital cost or the OPEX in relation to nuclear, it is much cheaper than what the government's proposing at the moment. We're a fraction of the $1.2 trillion of Labor's plan.
But there is no cheap energy future, is it? What Jeff Demery said is true, whether it's you or whether it's the government, electricity prices are going to rise in the near term and possibly the long term.
Well, but Chris, look at the international experience. Again, in Ontario, a third of the cost of electricity that we're paying here today. We have a high wage cost in our country and nobody's proposing to reduce wages. We have 3 levels of government. Well, there probably are people here who are suggesting that we should eliminate at least 1 level of government, and you can take your pick on different days, but we're not going to reduce the compliance cost and the regulatory burden to the point that can make us internationally competitive to comparable nations. We can try and we can reduce part of it, but it's an inbuilt cost. The one area, in my judgment, that we could say to the entire economy that we can reduce that input cost is in energy. We have an abundance of natural resource. We have the world crying out for minerals, for uranium, and we have a capacity here to bring the cost of electricity down, to transition, to decarbonise as we must, particularly as a trading nation. We're not talking about not having renewables in the system, but a whole renewable policy is going to end in disaster, and that's why I think if we look at the international example around cost, we should take some comfort from that.
One last thing from me before we go to the floor. How are you going to bring down the price of gas? Because essentially in the Australian marketplace at the moment, what is happening is that renewable energy is creating scarcity at peak times of the day, and gas is setting the wholesale power price, and the price of gas is high. How could you possibly get it down in the near term?
Well, you need to bring more supply on, there's no question about that. And there is an abundance of supply. There are projects ready to go, and we need to have more gas into the system. Now, the Teals and others will say that gas must be stopped immediately. Well, our economy closes down. That's the reality. And If you are in Labor's shoes at the moment, you don't like coal, you don't like gas, green hydrogen's not a reality, certainly not a commercial reality. You don't like nuclear. When Chris Bowen talks about an energy gap opening up over the next decade or two, the biggest risk is in Labor's model because they don't have a baseload power. They can talk about hydro, they can talk about batteries, but they don't have the storage ability and they don't have the generation capacity without gas. And the government says one thing on the West Coast and something very different in the inner city seats here in Sydney and in Melbourne, but you do need more gas, and we've been very clear about our desire to improve the approval processes while still being environmentally responsible and bringing more of those projects on more quickly.
All right, we'll go to the floor, and just so in case anyone asks, or people always do, I'm going to go with those ones that are getting the most votes from the floor. At the moment, leading by a long way was Peter with 11 votes on how much debt did Ontario take on to develop a nuclear industry, and while the world is building more nuclear reactors, how many have been built by Western nations this century?
Well, if you have a look at the Biden administration, what's just happened in the United States with, after some time delay and certainly a lot of expense, and again, it comes back to the first type and issues that Westinghouse, etc., had. You can have a look at the peculiarities of that case. But as the technology, as you move past number one, it becomes more affordable, more realistic. And in the case of Ontario, look at the user price today. So taking all of the systems costs into account, which we don't in this country at the moment. There's a dishonest debate about what it costs us to change wind turbines out every 19 years if they're offshore. The millions of dollars that go into the servicing, the landfill, the impact that it has. So I think when you look at it on a comparable basis, we can look not just to the United States and to Europe as we would, but look to Asia and elsewhere. And if 19 of the top 20 economies in the world are on this pathway and we're the only one, then I think your questions around cost will be dealt with.
Just a question on that, though, to add to that question, it is Ontario did take on a huge public debt. You would be, even though you're not giving us a figure at the moment, we're looking at something between $250 billion and $500 billion.
Well, I'm not going into the figures now, we'll release all of that, but the fact is that you end up with a much cheaper per unit cost under nuclear over time because of the amortisation period. And as I said before, with the collective billions of dollars going into research and development from all of those nations, west and east, all of that will translate into the next generation of power. It's inconceivable that countries in our own region, in Fiji and the Solomon Islands, in Papua New Guinea and elsewhere, will continue to rely on diesel generators that get turned off at 8 or 9 o'clock at night in some instances. They want to have a thriving and growing economy, and Australia risks, frankly, being left behind in pretty poor company, and I'd prefer to look at what's happening in the US, in Canada, in France, and many other countries around the world that we should be seeking to emulate, not the lowest common denominator.
Question from Giles Parkinson, who asks, what will the Coalition build to fill the gap as coal retires, and why will that not need new transmission?
Well, coal is going to stay in the system for a lot longer under what Labor's proposing, and at the moment, as we know, the New South Wales and Victorian state Labor governments are negotiating contracts with coal-fired generators to extend the life of those assets. That's the reality of what's happening today. Now, they don't talk about it, they don't want it publicly highlighted, but that's the reality. And so, as I said before, gas is going to be a huge feature. Renewables, fully supportive of renewables, but we also need to have an eye on the environmental impact. And at the moment, we're subverting environmental approval processes to find an outcome for some projects, where I think the social licence is starting to evaporate in some of those communities, and I think we need to deal with that reality as well. So there are a lot of moving parts.
Okay, question from Rob. Please enumerate the quantitative evidence that you have to back up your claim that nuclear power will deliver lower prices than renewable energy.
Well, I cited some of the nations and their lived experience. So again, part of the problem in our country, and it was when we were contemplating whether we would do the AUKUS deal or not, go with a nuclear-powered submarine. Our country is off a zero knowledge base in terms of nuclear compared to France, for example, or Canada or the United States or elsewhere. And if we look to the international experience, which I think is instructive, you can see the cost per kilowatt, per gig, depending on what part of the equation you're looking at. You can see the end cost. You can see the amortisation periods. You can see where the research and development money is going. And that's the reality of it.
A question from Giles Parkinson. The countries that you cite as having habitable nuclear and RE have no more than 18% renewables. Australia will soon be at 50%. It's actually at 40% at the moment. Will you seek to cap renewables at that level?
No, I think what we want to achieve is an outcome where we have a proper mix, where we have an eye on price. At the moment, it seems for many debates in this country around different infrastructure projects, investment into renewables, whatever it might be, that we've lost a sense of what the end user is paying. And the assumption is that margins will just be squeezed, which means that less projects get up, or that the end consumer will just pay exponentially more for their power or for the end service or good that they're being provided with. And my view is that we should be talking about not just transition and reliability, but that we should be talking about cost. And that's something that we want to generate as part of this debate, because if you look at, for example, green hydrogen, you've seen what Andrew Forrest has done in terms of moving his own money. You've seen what's happening in Japan and international markets otherwise in relation to green hydrogen. I'd love it to be a reality tomorrow, but it's not. It uses an enormous amount of water. It's expensive to pump the water. It's expensive to move the water. And there is limited social licence in the projects that they're talking about that would support literally millions of solar panels. Those communities won't accept it. So renewables absolutely in the system, but I think you make a judgment on that as we bring nuclear into the system.
Just before I go back to the pad, what are you hearing about demand? Because just in the United States and talking to the regulators there, one of them told me that they're now getting demands from data centres for 1 gigawatt of power. And as he said, putting that in perspective, that is the equivalent of putting a San Francisco on the grid. And so are you hearing from people that their expectations of what energy needs that we'll need in future are severely underdone?
Yeah, certainly. And look, I think the AI and data centres is a really interesting study here. We're a country with low or limited sovereign risk. We have a governance arrangement that's the envy of much of the world. We have stable policy settings, generally speaking, even though, as I said before, the 3 levels of government can bring a cost with all of that. We are a natural home for data storage and for countries, for companies to look to us in the defence space, in health, in storage of personal data otherwise. But it comes with an enormous power usage. And so, yes, the companies are talking about much greater usage across the networks. There's no question about that. And we see, I read the same article, in the United States, 1 gig at a time, when you see what Apple is doing, going into nuclear at their data centres or that desire, and many other companies as well. The reality of AI is that it is going to need that baseload power. It's not going to rely on intermittent power. It's not going to rely on the...
Opposition leader Peter Dutton taking tough questions about his nuclear energy policy.